Fresh air.
Hi, I'm Maisie McCabe, UK editor of Campaign, and welcome to Campaign's Media360 podcast, produced by Fresh Air Production, and recorded here at the 21st Conference in the Grand Hotel, Brighton. This year's theme was risk and innovation, so for this series we spoke to a huge range of marketing leaders to explore how they and their teams push the boundaries for their brands and clients. In this episode, Fresh Air's Director of Content, Michaela Hallam, spoke to Sam McAllister, speaker, former BBC producer and author of Scoops, which was developed into the hit Netflix show, Scoop.
Last month, Netflix released its most captivating film of 2024, Scoop, which delves into the events leading up to the BBC's infamous 2019 interview with Prince Andrew. At its heart is the remarkable story of journalist Sam McAllister, whose memoir inspired the film's narrative. Sam is speaking to Campaign's Maisie McCabe at the closing event for the conference. But ahead of that, she's taken the time to sit down with me. Welcome, Sam. Thank you for joining
nice to
me.
See you.
Sam McAllister, author and journalist, is how you're described in the Campaign agenda. How would you describe yourself?
Polymath, not to be confused with polyamorous, just to be clear. I'm just kind of doing so many different things right now. So author, absolutely. I was an exec on the movie that you've kindly mentioned for Netflix. I do speaking professionally, and then I do all other kinds of things, including teaching at the London School of Economics, where I am a visiting senior fellow, which sounds super impressive, I think.
I did not know that.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds super impressive. Not entirely sure what it means, but I'm really doing a lot of different things, and I'm loving that variety.
Brilliant. As we said in the intro, you're speaking today off the back of the Netflix film Scoop, which tells the story of the events leading up to that infamous interview. We'll talk about Prince Andrew. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's start with you. What's the biggest risk you'd say that you've taken in your life?
The biggest risk professionally was definitely walking away from being a barrister. I trained to be a criminal defence barrister, and I hated it with a visceral passion. But I had no plan. The plan had been to become the first, Lord Chief Justice who was a woman, Lady Chief Justice, as the case may be.
So that was the motivation.
that was a theoretical plan. I mean, I think in my head I had more of an Ally McBeal vibe, but I was sold a pup, I tell you. There was no dancing babies, no fun, no glamour, and certainly no kind of designer outfits. But I did it for 2 years. I loved the clients. The clients weren't the issue. Put me in a cell with an alleged serial killer, happy as a pig in mud.
There's a story there.
Yeah, there definitely is a podcast there, no doubt. But Chambers' life was brutal, particularly for someone from a slightly, not hugely different, but a slightly different background with a very different attitude to most of the people I was working with. So 2 years in, I had enough. And I literally left, because you're self-employed, with zero plan and zero idea what to do for the next, 400 years of employment, as it now
feels
is.
like. So how did you get from that point to where you are now then?
Well, at that stage, I'd realised, because I came from a background with no connections. My parents both left school at 14. Brilliant parents, but you just no networks.
Yeah.
Never met a lawyer until I became one, that kind of vibe. First in my family to go to university. And really, I'd learned in that quite brutal period from going to university and law school, baptisms of fire in terms of class and all those kinds of issues.
Yes.
That connections were everything. And I didn't have many, but at that stage I did have some female friends who worked in interesting jobs. And so I threw myself on their mercy and asked them if I could spend a day with them in their places of employment. And one of them happened to work at Radio 4 on a programme called Law in Action, which was a magazine programme with legal issues, and none of them were lawyers. So lo and behold, a lawyer arrives and they think you know the law, like everything, which was not true in my case. But I spent a couple of days, became 6 weeks, and there we were, sort of like 16 years later.
Wow, okay, so we've got there already. You, like me, spent quite a long time at the BBC. The theme of this conference this year is about risks and taking risks. Was the BBC a good place culturally to be able to take risks?
No. I think the BBC is extremely risk averse, and that means that someone like me who likes to take risks is probably really enjoying themselves. I imagine if I'd been somewhere where everyone was taking risks, it would have been very destabilizing. But as it was, I felt like I was this kind of, maverick. who kind of did things a bit differently.
So that actually almost empowered you
I feel
to
it
push.
did. Yeah, ironically. I think it was just kind of that susceptibility to rebel, in a sense, against the norm. And I would have had a much easier and probably much more successful, to be honest, professional life if I towed the line and just kind of like done the thing that everyone else was doing. I feel I would have been promoted more. You know, I was probably a bit of a pain to work with sometimes because I was always chasing the dream, the big get, the big interview, the story that no one else thought we could get, the person that was impossible. And 99 times out of 100, everyone else was right and I was wrong. But now and again, the risk would pay off.
But do you think that maybe the BBC doesn't have enough Sam McAllisters in it?
Well, you know, I don't want to kind of be narcissistic, but I think that the risk averseness is a problem because when you think of the BBC's journalism, unfortunately, in terms of scoops, you know, headline grabbing, front page kind of exclusives, there just really aren't any, and it's a vast organisation. So what I really noticed was the difference between myself and my friends who worked, you know, in tabloids or in broadsheets, where the expectation is you get new lines and news stories all the time, or you're out.
Yes.
And it wasn't really like that at the BBC. In a sense, it was almost the opposite, that you followed the news rather than broke it.
Yeah.
And I found that quite challenging and counterintuitive. And I don't think it does the BBC many favours, to be honest.
So how would you go about creating a culture where it's positive to take risks? How would you kind of create that sort of working environment?
I think it's just an environment in which you have like strong leaders who are chasing lines, you know. I mean, my measure of success was always how many pages did I get in the Daily Mail, either shouting at the content I'd done or highlighting the content I'd done. Because I think the change that needs to be made is understanding that if you do hundreds of hours of broadcast and no one ever hears about them, you know, philosophically, do they exist?
And you need to create that ripple effect.
Correct.
Right? So that you're the start of something that then explodes into something bigger.
Exactly, and that is something that is lauded and applauded. In a sense, I think, unfortunately, because it's such a big mechanism, it's not agile. So let's say, for example, you had what you knew was a news-making story. My news instincts were definitely very good, if some of my other instincts weren't, but they definitely were, that I knew would make it into the Mail or the Times or the Telegraph. You know, you couldn't even sometimes get the website to put it out there. You'd have to push it out yourself through PA, like on your own time in addition.
Yeah.
And then it would make national and international news. And then maybe a day later, the BBC would report its own content. And that, I think, is the shame of it, because there's so much good content, but it sometimes never gets heard about.
That, again, is almost counterintuitive, because the BBC spends quite a lot of its time wanting to avoid being in the Daily Mail.
Correct. Correct.
So you're trying to create something where actually you become the news as a result of breaking the news. And how does that kind of fit into that whole ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's just a fear of the tabloids in particular. I mean, in the movie, you know, I'm accused, as it would be, of being very Daily Mail, which I took as a compliment because I understand what people are interested in. But there's a difference between being in the Daily Mail because, let's say, theoretically, you're Director General. I'm not saying he has, but, you know, he spent £50,000 on taxes or going to corporate gigs. That's one type of news. It's entirely different being in the news if you've broken a story that the whole nation needs to hear about. And not just Prince Andrew, but a number of stories I worked on, like Paul Flowers, who was the guy who was known as the Crystal Methodist, who was the former guy at the Co-op who kind of disappeared. I spent a year tracking down. He did an exclusive. Jeremy did an interview with him, and I think it was 6 pages in the Mail. That's the kind of coverage that gives resonance and clarity and answers that question: why does the BBC exist? And do I, as an average member of the British public, which I am too, do I ever see its content if I choose to kind of like avoid the website or it's
Or
kind
be
of
in
like,
that bubble.
Exactly that.
Going back to the Netflix film, did you feel like it was a risk signing your story over? I know that you're an exec producer on it, but how did that feel in terms of that kind of context of risk?
I think to an outsider it would be a huge risk because it looks, you know, such a big move from writing a little book, which was a huge risk. I left my job. My hand was forced. If I wanted to stay, I couldn't write the book.
Right.
So I threw the dice, and that was probably the biggest risk I've taken since leaving the bar, because I have a child now who I raise on a single income. So massive risk. The Netflix movie was much less of a risk because of the people I'd met who I knew were going to be working on it. It was all secret to begin with. It was all like kept under my hat, figuratively. But Sanjay Singhal from Voltage Television, who used to work at Newsnight, funnily enough, who was the first person that approached me, who I signed with, along with Hilary Salmon and Radford Neville at Lighthouse. Hilary had run BBC Drama for a long time. They were proper high caliber people.
Yeah.
And in their hands, I felt very safe. And then when I met the Netflix execs, because we were lucky enough to have a number of offers to work on a drama of some kind, then I felt even more reassured because they included me relentlessly. And I didn't expect that. So I felt that the risk was very much mitigated by the caliber of the people I was working with.
Okay. We've got sirens going past us on the Brighton seafront. If
Well,
you
as
can
long as
hear
they're not
that
coming
wherever
for
you're
us,
listening.
maybe it's the BBC police coming for me. I love the BBC, just to be clear. It's just some insights.
In the Netflix interpretation of the story, almost ironically, the person who seemed to understand the risk they were taking least was Prince Andrew. What does that tell us about risk and about how people go into situations?
Yeah, I think that it's all about peril, to be honest. You know, let's take, for example, me leaving a stable job that I've worked at, that I'm good at, that I can do with my eyes closed, to write a book when nobody knows I exist. Huge risk, and a risk that I'm cognizant of. For Prince Andrew, by the time I kind of met him, lucky man, he was 59, you know, and there were really, apart from his time in the military, no perceptible risks to him. You know, he's never done a 360, had an appraisal, lost out on a job, worried about a bill, you know.
So almost that life experience, or lack of
Exactly.
that life experience.
So I think life experience really gives you, you know, the prep for understanding risk and peril. But he had never really, other than his military time, had any real peril that most of us face every day in a cost of living crisis or with political instability. You're not touched by that.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I feel it's not stupidity, which a lot of people have accused him of. I would defend against that. I think it's imperviousness. It's not even high-handedness. It's just complete lack of insight, understanding, and experience of any form of real risk.
So brands are very aware of risk.
As they should be.
And they're honestly often quite terrified of having their own Prince Andrew moment. Especially when they think they're doing something good and then that backfires. So how do you think that, bearing in mind the context of where we're sat today, how do you think that brands can mitigate against risk but still push boundaries and make progress?
I think it's two things, really. The first thing is that, as I said to Prince Andrew, unfortunately, you know, you just can't pretend that the world doesn't exist.
I love the fact, how many people can say that? As I said to Prince Andrew.
What can I say? I can say, as I said to Gillian Anderson. I'm really going for it. I apologise. But, you know, really, you can't just pretend that the world isn't out there anymore. So as a brand, obviously, if you just put your head in the sand, people expect corporate responsibility, social responsibility. They're very interested in what CEOs, CTOs, board members, their private lives, you know, their professional lives. They want to know what brands stand for, particularly, you know, when cost of living crisis and they're spending, you know, carefully. But separately, the way you mitigate the risk is through self-knowledge and not having acolytes around you. You know, the peril.
Emperor's new clothes situation.
Correct. The peril that you create, you know, as Prince Andrew had, but lots of CEOs and CFOs or CTOs or whatever it is have, is you're surrounded by sycophants. And they may be very well-meaning people, but the ex-news journalist who comes in and is a pain in your bottom, who says to you, well, here are the three immediate things that if Jeremy Paxman was being briefed by me to interview you, that they would ask about, then your risk is mitigated. Because the mistake that most interviewees make is, A, they think they can control the narrative, a phrase we should ban. B, they think that they can basically take things the way they want to in terms of the questions, which is not true. And C, that they can ignore difficult questions, also impossible. So the way to mitigate risk is to have insight into the flaws and the weaknesses of your argument, because knowing the good stuff is easy. The hard part is knowing the weaknesses and having truthful, fair, non-aggressive, non-defensive, polite answers so that you don't become the story by being a bit of an a-hole.
Almost going full circle back to preparing your lines of inquiry, in advance? All of those things what's the hardest question I could get asked and having that answer prepared?
I think the hardest question is always about something, that you consider fatal to your brand that you're trying to evade. I mean, we did an interview with Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google, and he arrived with all of those things, wanting to control the narrative. He won't answer this. Well, we don't care about that. We'll do what we like. And we don't agree to that. But, the only thing we cared about was taxation. And the only thing he cared about was avoiding taxation. And, so in a sense, the killer question is always the thing that you're most trying to avoid. So my advice strongly would always be to basically just put that question first. Don't even wait to be asked. Just come out straight away with, look, obviously, the thing that everyone cares about in the British public is our tax issue. Let me tell you about it.
But you
takes
also,
the fire out of it.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
You also don't want to be
away.
Theresa May or Rishi Sunak, where you kind of only ever give one answer to every question, so that you're always prepared with that single answer that you never waver from.
The difference is, I think, is the courage of listening to questions. So the problem we face, I think, with political interviews are twofold. First of all, that we've got into this very unfortunate dynamic between journalists and politicians, which I think we should also take responsibility for, which is just, maul, poke. Nobody learns anything. Everyone gets angry. It's just not really good to listen to be honest.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that I do a lot of interviews nowadays, and really the only way to sound like you're saying anything original or sincere is to say original, sincere things, because you listen to the question and you literally respond to the question. And I think the fatal error of most politicians is they're asked about, planning law, and then they talk about cheese sandwiches. It's just not going to cut the mustard, to continue with the culinary theme.
You talked about the dynamic between journalists and politicians. I think there's a really interesting and increasing crossover between the dynamic of journalism and marketing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's tricky. I mean, I think really you just have to handle everything with such integrity. I mean, again, I'm sorry to return to the Daily Mail. I grew up on it, but, my thought was always, and thank God I had this thought given what happened to me, if you could read this email or listen to this conversation and you were a Daily Mail journalist and you could put it on your front page, how do I sound? And in my dealings with high-powered places, I always bore that in mind, but in every dealing.
Yes.
And I think that the lines that blur sometimes between journalism and marketing could do with a reminder of thinking about what this looks like in terms of, being in the pocket of something, or being naive, or being lazy sometimes because you just want to get some copy, but you haven't really looked into the veracity of the claims. So it creates more hard work for the journalist, but rightly so, because that's the job.
What about optics and understanding all the different perceptions of whatever it is you put out there?
Yeah, I think there is sometimes a naivety about that, because a lot of journalists have never worked in anything outside journalism. So, understanding like a phrase or a behaviour that you think is perfectly acceptable, but to, an average member of the public might be despicable or deplorable. And you often see that disconnect. I mean, you can see it, for example, a random example that's not really, but, with the Philip Schofield case, where many members of the public felt that his behaviour, if true, was the kind of thing, nothing to do with his sexuality, but, the kind of thing that would basically make him a persona non grata, just like a despicable human. And lots of the commentariat class, as I would call that, thought that this was, an attack on his sexuality, and had he really done anything wrong, to broadly kind of say what they were saying. And I think there's often a disconnect between those two worlds. So the problem the journalist also faces is he or she doing something that they think is fine, but as soon as the general public hear about it, they'll think it's deplorable or, lacking integrity. So you've got a lot of things you've got to consider. But as I said, that's the job.
You have given me a lot of things to consider. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us ahead of your appearance on stage at Media360 this afternoon. I've had the privilege of talking to Sam McAllister. Thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Campaign Media360 podcast, presented by Michaela Hallam, the Director of Content at Fresh Air Production, our podcast partner. There are lots more conversations to hear with a great range of marketing leaders, so please follow on your favoured platform so you don't miss an episode.